Can you explain Nietzsche's general philosophy and some of his most famous ideas? He's really hard to comprehend. Nietzsche's general philosophy. I probably can't do that. I've been putting together, with my students here, I've been starting to plan a seminar on existentialism and which would focus a lot on Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. I think Nietzsche is so damn complicated that you can't really do that. I don't think you can explain Nietzsche's general philosophy. First of all, he wasn't really a systematizer. He was skeptical of systematizers. It's very difficult to distill someone who's not a systematizer into, a few general principles. And the thing is, with some of the greatest thinkers, you actually have to read what they wrote. You have to read the original writings, because the brilliance is encapsulated in the original writings, and they can't be condensed. So let's see, can I do any better than that? Can I explain Nietzsche's general philosophy? Truth serves life. That's a good one. And I guess we could unpack that a little bit. I mean, it's a good example of exactly why Nietzsche is so staggeringly brilliant. One of the things he presumes when he makes a statement like that is that a human being is in an existential situation that's characterized by the necessity of determining what he or she will actually accept as truth. You might say, well, truth is something you can prove, and that's how you know it's true. But unfortunately, it's not that simple, because you have to decide what criteria you're going to accept as proof. And there's an act of faith in that, and there's an inalienable where that argument seems to be lacking, and this is the famous is-ought conundrum that David Hume described. Is, okay, well, let's say that you use science to lay out a very detailed description of the nature of the objective world. Well, that still doesn't mean that you know how to act in that world. And that's a big problem. It might be a fundamental problem if the fundamental problem of people isn't what is the nature of the objective world, but how is it that you should conduct yourself while you're alive? Well, Nietzsche believed that the fundamental question was how you should conduct yourself while you're alive. How should you act? And I would say that's the fundamental question of meaning. And science can inform you, but it can't really solve that problem for you. And that's a problem. And then science also has this other terrible attribute in some sense, which is that because science can't solve the problem of how you should act in the world, it impels people towards the conclusion that there is no answer to the question, how should you act in the world? And so that way, that opens up a door to nihilism, and nihilism is it's destructive. It does not facilitate life. In fact, it has the opposite effect. It takes the spirit out of people. It takes the motivation out of people. It makes them bitter. It makes them resentful. It makes them hateful. It's not a good thing. Also, Nietzsche is primarily concerned in some sense with how to act. And part of the reason that he decomposes Christianity to the degree that he does is because he believed that Christianity was a very, very serious attempt to answer the question, how should you act? And he also believed that it had become fatally flawed for a variety of reasons, at least in its typical socially instantiated form. So he took it upon himself to subject it to a criticism. But I've always thought of Nietzsche, it's a terrible image, but I've always thought of Nietzsche as like a maggot in a wound. It's like what he's doing is clearing away dead and diseased tissue so that something else can live. And it's a terrible thing to watch. It's a terrible thing to apprehend. And it's a terribly destructive thing to involve yourself in. Because Nietzsche he said he philosophized with a hammer, and that's certainly true. But he was trying to clear the path for something new, and that something new he was trying to formulate with his conceptions, such as like this, the Superman, the next version of human beings, so to speak. And he thought of them as people who would create their own values. and that would be the way forward out of the wreckage of Christianity, let's say. I think Nietzsche was wrong about that, and I say that with all due respect, believe me, and I say it cautiously, and I don't think it's an original idea of my own that Nietzsche was wrong, and I think the reason that he was wrong is because people don't create values, they discover them. Or maybe they co-create them. But you can't create values by conjuring them out of non-existence. You could say, if you were scientifically minded, that values are in some sense arbitrary, and then if you believe that values are arbitrary, you might then believe that people could create them out of nothing. But values aren't arbitrary, and most of the time people discover them, and maybe they co-create them. And one of the reasons that I have been so attracted to Jung's thinking is because Jung is in many ways a Nietzschean, a student of Nietzsche, also a student of Freud's, but more primarily a student of Nietzsche. And Jung's lifelong endeavor was to understand what the way forward might be given the situation that Nietzsche described. And the situation that Nietzsche described in some sense was that Christianity laid so much emphasis on truth that it ended up undermining its own axiomatic presuppositions. And so then Jung thought, following Nietzsche, well, okay, in principle we have to create new values. But that's partly why Jung got so interested in the unconscious, because one of the things he found, particularly in his analysis of the collective unconscious, was that the values that Nietzsche thought people should create were actually lying dormant in our imagination. That's one way of thinking about it, because that's a good way of thinking about the collective unconscious. And that it was a return to the deepest, the way forward in terms of the generation of new values was a return to the deepest recesses of human existence and a rediscovery of what was actually there. And I touched on that a little bit today when I was talking about the necessity for sacrifice. Like, there's an archetypal idea that the Savior, the Messiah, is by definition the person who is willing to sacrifice him or herself for the ultimate good, whatever that happens to be, and that's the appropriate pathway forward. Well, that's an archetypal critique of Christianity, and I think that Jung was right. I think he's correct. That's a terrible thing to say, because I mean Jung is such a radical thinker that it's funny, because Jung is subject to a lot of criticism. I mean, I read Richard Knoll's book on Nietzsche. I think it was called The Aryan Christ, and Knoll, basically, who I think was a very resentful person. I think he did a hatchet job on Jung. The cover of his book made Jung look like he was a Nazi. I mean, what a cheap shot that is. But he accused Jung of basically fomenting a cult. And I read Knoll's book, and it just made me laugh, because what Jung was actually up to is so much worse, so to speak, than merely starting a cult. It's like accusing an axe murderer of what? Annoying his pet cat. The difference is that extensive. The sorts of things that Jung was actually messing around with are so complicated and terrible compared to just building a little cult that, it's absolutely clear that Knoll had no idea what he was talking about. Jung is, like Nietzsche, like Dostoevsky, is a terrifying person. And I think part of the reason that Jung is not well regarded in the academy, and also why Christianity is subject to such continual rationalistic criticism, is because people open up Jung and take one look at what he's doing and either just don't get it at all, or they get a little bit of it. It scares them so badly they think, there's no damn way I'm going there. And I can really understand that. I think anybody with any sense would be very, very careful about trying to figure out what Jung was talking about.